This is a bonus edition of Space Minds by SpaceNews. This week we're at the Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, where we've been recording an episode each day at our booth 1331. As a reminder, if you have news, submit your press release through Stellar Dispatch and get in front of Space News. Our guest today is Brad Head, Managing Director of International Partnerships at Elara Nova. He sits down with Chief Content and Strategy Officer Mike Gruss to break down the latest news and insights from the symposium.
Hi, I'm Mike Gruss with SpaceNews, and we are back with another bonus episode of our Space Minds podcast here on the floor of the exhibit hall at Space Symposium. I'm joined today by Brad Head of Elara Nova. Brad, thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
I know one of the big events that we were going to watch this week was General Saltzman's speech yesterday. He talked a lot about an international strategy there. Tell me what stuck out to you from that speech and kind of what you were hoping to hear and what your takeaways were.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So the international partnership strategy is something that we've been working on for a period of time. I used to be in the government. I was the International Affairs Director at Spock for 18 months, working with Deanna Riles, who is now at SAF-IA, kind of helping put that together with Air Marshal Godfrey. The international partnership strategy is designed to provide that framework for how we intelligently engage with our allies and partners. I think it tracks back to General Saltzman when he went to the Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference in 2023, talking with our allies and partners and hearing their frustration about the way we approach cooperation. At that point, the way that we had approached it was the U.S. had what we had, and then allies and partners would contribute something. It was kind of sprinkles on top.
Yeah.
And then we got into, okay, well, now we have a plan, but it's really classified. I can't tell you about it, but we need more of this here and there. And that's kind of unsatisfying for our partners. And so he had articulated this idea of we've got to be able to get to a point where we can do kind of collective requirements determination and use it like an international JROC is the way he described it, of how do we pull these things together. And so I think part of this partnership strategy is trying to operationalize that idea of working with our allies and partners to build the collective requirements that we know that we need by mission area laid down over the globe to be able to achieve all the collective effects that we need to achieve.
And what I think, it can sound like another document, right? Just like something else that maybe it's going to go on a desk in the Pentagon. But why are those types of documents important?
Well, I think in this case, space is unique, unlike all the other domains where all of the nations have kind of developed along at the same time. As we now think about space and the number of nations that are getting actively involved in space and standing up space commands or space components and getting involved in the space field, we are significantly farther ahead than literally everybody else. I mean, there's a handful of European nations and like Australia that they have significant capabilities, but for the most part, I think the U.S., they look to the U.S. as kind of the hub of international space cooperation. And so they expect that we have a framework where we know we have these things covered, but we could use some more of this here or that type of thing there. And so they're looking at us to be that kind of integrator when it comes to collective space requirements, determination, architectures. And so there's some work done in the Space Force staff looking at things like we have a discussion about what is our fielded force, what is our program force? So fielded force is what you have. Program force is what we are in the process of buying. And then what is the objective force? In the ideal end state, here's what you would have by architecture, by mission area. And the gap between what you can afford and what you would ideally like to have is an opportunity for allies and partners to coming alongside and say, I can do some of that. Yeah. Again, whether it's because they have unique geography that we can take advantage of, or whether it's they just deliver real capabilities.
Well, and let's talk about that. One way to close that gap potentially could be through NATO.
Right.
There was a panel yesterday.
Right.
Some talk about, hey, there could be a higher amount contributed from NATO countries. I think the number was as high as 3.5%, potentially $400 billion. Sounds like some of that would likely go towards space. So what does that trickle-down effect look like to you?
No, absolutely. So I worked at NATO for 5 years, and I spent 2 years as the guy with the U.S. lapel pin sitting at the table talking to allies about their 2% and what they were or were not doing. And so there is a demand signal. I think Tom Goffis, who spoke, is the Assistant Secretary General for Operations, mentioned that there's a summit coming up in June. They expect at that summit there will be an agreement to increase the level of defense spending to 3 or 3.5% or whatever the ultimate goal will be over the period of time, which will bring in significant amount of resources if allies all meet that target. And we think that a big chunk of that would go towards delivering space capabilities. And so then it's a matter of again, just like what the service is trying to do, NATO is also in the process of trying to do. So if you look today at NATO's plans for the deterrence and defense of the North Atlantic, which is their kind of big operational plan, or they have 3 regional plans along the eastern flank, and you flip back to the classified space annex, at some level it just says space will happen. Because there's not anybody there, there's not enough of the right types of people to help flesh out with the level of details. And so there's an initiative out there right now that they're looking at taking and fleshing out the operational requirements that are associated with those plans, and then turning those into what the U.S. would call a JUON, a Joint Urgent Operational Needs Statement, that would then be communicated to allies and partners as a way of jump-starting their big long-term NATO defense planning process, which is a 4-year cycle that really gets to the capability target. So when allies get, when we talk to them on an annual basis about, are you meeting your capability, are you meeting your defense investment goal in order to deliver on your assigned capability target? So we think that there's an opportunity here over the next period of time to help kind of flesh out what those are, so that NATO is providing that comprehensive picture of, do we have enough of the right types of things to deliver all we need to in space? And then the next question when we can get is how do you command and control that? But we can talk about that.
Well, one thing I wanted to touch on was, I think there's 2 things going on here, right? There's obviously tension on a large scale with a lot of our allies right now, or a lot of U.S. allies right now. But I think at the same time, there's been a lot of talk here about where there are opportunities for collaboration, and even from some unexpected countries that, hey, we didn't think that they would be there. So could you
absolutely.
talk about the tension there, and then how that plays out here or it doesn't? Because what we heard yesterday from a whole series of folks was like, oh, it's not affecting space.
So 2 things. One, I think, without getting political, I think the military to military cooperation transcends the churn that's happening in capitals at some level. So that's a good thing, and that kind of keeps things steady at the alliance in some ways. But I think what you see is you've got opportunities for how do we collectively procure these sorts of things. So when I worked at the Office of Defense Cooperation in Belgium, which supported Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the majority, the government of Luxembourg is the majority shareholder of a company called SES. And so they had worked out this deal where the U.S. and Luxembourg are going to go together under a contract under the NATO Support Procurement Agency to collectively procure satellite communication as a service, a contract, which then other allies and partners could buy into at a pre-negotiated rate. And that became a framework for, we could collectively do this, because space is complicated and expensive. And so a lot of our NATO nations are not in a position to spend the types of money that it would take to field significant space capabilities. But if they can come together either at 32 or in smaller subsets, and so again, I mentioned APSS, the Alliance Persistent Surveillance from Space Initiative. There's one there for SDA, there's another one for imagery, where how do we collectively pool our resources together to deliver these sorts of capabilities that maybe we individually couldn't do that. It also helps to ensure that you don't have gaps or overlap, right? So if 32 nations are going to collectively contribute to this, pool of forces and capabilities, you don't want to leave things off the table because I thought you had it and you thought I had it. At the same time, if everybody's buying SDA, if every nation spent all their money just building an SDA picture...
You don't want 9 short stops.
Right, that would be horribly inefficient. So if we can collectively procure that, and then you can focus on electromagnetic warfare or satellite communication, or if you have a niche capability, some nations are more interested on the enabling side of the alliance of space, and there are a handful of nations that are more comfortable with the more operational aspects of space that we've heard a lot about this week in the space superiority panel.
Well, and that's what I think thematically, with just a little bit of time, with General Whiting's speech, it kind of created I think he really did a good job showing the need, explaining why space is a warfighting domain now, not will be or could be, but is right now. And then General Saltzman talked a lot about, and here's potentially one way to help alleviate some of the tension there.
Yeah.
But talk to me what your takeaways were from General Whiting's speech there.
No, I think so. For General Whiting, the thing that struck me was the conversation about Operation Olympic Defender and some of these frameworks that we've developed. So Olympic Defender is the collection of, we've now grown it to 7 nations in the last year. Since the last Space Symposium, we now have France, Germany, and New Zealand who are part of Olympic Defender, which is great, particularly France and Germany, because in the space domain, because it's so classified, it's easier to bring in, not easy, but it is easier to bring in your Five Eyes partners to talk about things. But when you start bringing in these other nations, there's no network and there's no framework to talk about. There's not a classification for Five Eyes plus these 2 countries. There's not a network that we communicate on. So I think the fact that we brought them in and we're actively working through that. In fact, today there's a Space Chiefs Forum. General Saltzman is hosting a Space Chiefs Forum. General Whiting will be there. And then tomorrow there's an Operation Olympic Defender meeting in the morning and then a CSPO meeting in the afternoon. I think these forums are good frameworks to do that. And so the fact that we're expanding OOD and we're trying to deliver those sorts of capabilities, I think is a helpful thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about the commercial element of that.
Yeah.
You've been on the floor here. What have been some of your takeaways, and how do you think about commercial fitting into what we've been talking about this morning?
So there's a massive overlap, I think, between commercial and international, and I think it's interesting. So I'll use a real world example. When I was at NATO in 2014, Russia had annexed Crimea, and my NGA rep that we had at NATO would come by and say, hey, everybody was discussing, are they little green men or are they Russians, right?
Yeah.
So my NGA rep would come by and say, hey, here's a picture. Those are very clearly Russians in Russian uniforms with Russian equipment. Would this be useful to give to NATO? We said, yeah, absolutely. And he'd say, well, I can't because it came off of some exquisite system.
Right.
But hold on a second. Let me go call Maxar, whoever, $500 later, at this geographic location, at this date timestamp, what do you got? Oh, that's good enough.
Yeah.
He'd run the credit card and get a picture, and now we could give that to NATO. It's frustrating to me that we have this desire and we clearly articulate this need to partner to win, but then at the same time, we end up having to use our commercial to bypass our own inability to share sensitive, exquisite stuff. And so I think we're moving past that. Hopefully we continue to accelerate that because, I mean, if you walk around this floor, you can watch, for example, Exoanalytics will do a demonstration where they will show a GSAP intercept of objects in the geo orbit. And years ago, you could never even talked about that. And now I can sit in a hotel ballroom and watch them give a briefing that demonstrates that capability. And so when the commercial industry is able to do the most exquisite things, I mean, I think about, in my world, for example, on-orbit servicing and refueling. If you can get up close to something and you can touch it to fix it or refuel it, you could just as easily break it or take it somewhere else, right? So that is one of the most exquisite, sensitive things that we think about doing. And industry is able to do that and is in the process of becoming able to do that. So it's changing the world. And I hope that reduces the barriers to classification that really hamper our ability to talk intelligently about space with our allies and partners.
Well, and I'm thinking about General Saltzman again said something we've heard for more than a decade, which is, hey, we needed to classify more information, do it faster. And I think that gets to your point, which is like how that would happen.
Absolutely. I think a challenge right now is the churn. It's not a churn, it's just the turnover in administration. So we've seen somebody be nominated for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. We've got a secretary and undersecretary that are on their way. So I think as those positions get filled and we get kind of clarity on where we want to go, I believe, obviously, the Trump administration stood up the Space Force, they stood up Space Command, they've got an affinity for space, and I think that there will be a pressure to continue to move in that direction.
Let me back up a little bit. This has been obviously very busy week.
Absolutely.
What were you kind of looking for going in, and not surprises so much, but maybe some clues or some nuance, a little more texture to some of these discussions? What were you looking for, and what did you hear?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I was hoping to hear, which didn't actually come out, unfortunately, General Saltzman talked about it in generic terms, was the international partnership strategy. That was the kind of biggest deliverable.
You wanted the actual document?
I was hoping that, and the intent was for that to drop, but we don't have a Secretary of the Air Force, and so there's a desire to kind of hold off until he shows up, I think, before we rolled out. But that was the biggest kind of thing. I think another fascinating thing that was, so we had a discussion, Deanna Riles from SAF-IA hosted a panel talking about space superiority, and it included a representative from Sweden and Norway.
Right.
And I don't know that in
countries that you think of.
Yeah, historically, that's not, if you were going to talk about space superiority or space control, it would have been a handful, not even all of the Five Eyes nations.
Yes.
And now we've got in that world, very non-traditional partners. But Sweden is one of the newest members of NATO, right? So it's appropriate that they're there and they're part of that conversation. I think, just in the grand sense, our military way of doing war and our society's way of doing life is all predicated on an assumption that space will be available on the day.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a valid assumption anymore. And that's one of the conversations that I think we're having with our allies, and we're certainly having in the NATO context. Is, okay, if that's no longer a valid assumption, what are you willing to do about that? Protect and defend. Okay, what does that mean? What types of systems do you have to have? Whether it's being able to sense and be aware of what's up there or do anything about it. Golden Dome, I think, was another one where we've heard a little bit about that. I think the challenge right now is there's so much work being done behind the scenes to try and understand what does that mean. What is Golden Dome? What is the set of tools and capabilities that are going to be a part of that? We have the general outline of that, but I think this is another example of where international cooperation can be a big player. Whether it's
we haven't heard a ton about that so far.
No. And in my conversations with our allies, we get a lot of, hey, what does that mean and what can we do to help with that? I think, for example, when the Japanese Prime Minister came to meet with President Trump, that was an area that they talked about and said, hey, we're willing to help cooperate on that. So it could be something as simple as they have geography and they're willing to let us put something on their soil as some sort of sensor or maybe an effector. And in general, when we think about these things, it can be either they let us put something there, they put something and they share the data off of that, or we cooperatively develop a system like we've done with DARC in the AUKUS framework. There's different ways that we can go about doing that. So it will be interesting to see as Golden Dome continues to be unpacked. I can tell you every conversation I have with allies and partners, that is one of the things that they ask. Say, hey, is there, can we or should we expect to do something with this? We'll see.
I think that's the same conversation that's happening on the floor, right? I think every booth is saying, hey, is there an opportunity for me to get in on some of that money that could be coming with Golden Dome? Yeah,
absolutely. And it's money, it's technology, it's being part of that that framework that's going to be important. I mean, the challenge is that it's more than missile defense, right? There are new emerging threats that are very challenging. And so I think it's not just us that are worried about that. There are other allies and partners that are worried about for themselves too. And so being part of that development so that they can help, field the right systems that are good for our collective security is helpful.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have. Brad, thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Hey, for our viewers, thanks so much for watching this week. We'll be back with an episode of Space Minds next week. You can stop by our booth if you're still in town. We have our show daily. Our reporters have been filing dozens and dozens of stories all week. You can find all those on spacenews.com. We also have our printer shoe here from April. Thanks so much for watching.